Welcome everybody to the third WADM webinar of 2018. Today's webinar will focus on terror medicine. Today's presenter is Professor Leonard Cole. Professor Cole is an expert on bioterrorism and terror medicine. He is the director of the program on terror medicine and security at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, located in the United States. Trained in health sciences and public policy, he holds a master's and PhD in political science from Columbia University and a doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania School of Dental Medicine. I would like to mention that when Professor Cole concludes the webinar, there'll be an opportunity for some question and answer, and I'll be able to unmute your microphone and you'll be able to ask a question directly to Professor Cole, or if you prefer, you can send me a message or a question through the text feature and I can read it out loud. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Cole.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to everybody who's on the call or on the webinar. I'll be happy to go through the material that I have here and do a little explaining, and then be happy to answer or discuss with you any comments that any of the viewers and listeners might have. As Andrew mentioned, I have a background in the health sciences, in dental medicine, and also in public policy. This odd combination put together enabled me to look at questions having to do with science policy, and I've done a good deal of writing about that. And soon after the turn of into the 21st century, I was contacted by an Israeli colleague. He was the actually Deputy Director General of Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. And he suggested that he and I might do some collaborative work, because Israel was then in the midst of what was called the Intifada. Terrorist attacks on Israeli citizens were happening fairly frequently, and it's sometimes as many as 1 or 2, 3 a week, where there would be bombings or stabbings, and more than 1,000 Israelis were killed, murdered during that 5-year period between about 2000 and 2005. And in the course of that experience, the Israelis really revved up their response capabilities and prevention capabilities. Now, the term terror medicine emerged in Israel from that 5-year experience, and it was a term that applied to how they do things in a way, and learned from their experiences, that I found then and still do very applicable, very helpful outside of Israel. Now, not everything that the Israelis did was necessarily relevant or helpful to how it might be conducted elsewhere, but there's enough there that I think that it's a very good learning experience. So you'll see that while my presentation is much broader than about what happens in Israel, there's a fair amount of overlap with that area. So let me get started with the pictures here. What are the essential elements of terrorism? Unfortunately, there's not a universal definition, a universally accepted definition. Different countries have different definitions. The very bottom, which you see in bold here, is there is no good terrorism versus bad terrorism. And yet the United Nations has been unable to come up with a single definition, because a block of countries, mainly the Muslim countries, have said that in their particular cause for what they call resistance, there should be no limitations on the kinds of violence that might be used in response to what they consider the resistance. But for our purposes, and this is a non-political discussion we're going to have today, for our purposes, there's a pretty much consensus understanding that there are 3 essential elements of something before it's called terror or terrorism. Violence or threat of violence. The aim, targeted people, would be non-combatants. And the third purpose would be intended to influence a person's or a group's beliefs or policies or ideologies or behavior. So I hope you'll all agree with me that we will drop the notion that there is any form of terrorism that would be legitimate in any civilized society. Okay, why terrorism? Why do we mention terror medicine as opposed to, say, just emergency medicine or disaster medicine? Well, in part, it gains more attention. it is important in its own right to deal with terrorism, but the ability to bring on more interest, more focus, and therefore possibly more cooperation and understanding of how you prevent and then also respond to terrorism is helpful, and therefore you draw attention to the subject in general of how you have to deal with disaster or other emergency events. So here's an example of a huge difference in attention grabbing when there is a terrorism incident versus a non-terrorism incident, each of which could be considered a mass casualty. So many of you will recall that in April of 2013, on the 15th of April, there was a terrorism event in Boston during the Boston Marathon, and there were 3 people killed. There were many injured, some of them very serious, very near critical, and but there was minimal property damage. And yet only a couple of days later, with the Boston Marathon still fresh on everybody's mind, there was a plant explosion, a fertilizer plant explosion in Southwest Texas, and it killed 15 people, and there were also many people injured, and more than 350 buildings had been damaged or destroyed. So there was much more of an effect, a destructive effect in the Texas situation than there was in the Boston situation. And yet, when you look at this, which prompted more public interest and media coverage, you can see the vast difference that as of last year, the Boston Marathon bombing had drawn over 2 million hits of interest through Google searches. And the Texas fertilizer plant, which initially was thought to have been totally an accident, nothing deliberate, nothing man-made, was much less, drew much less interest. I have to put a little asterisk there, an amendment. There had been a couple of years after 2013 rather, the question of whether there was a deliberate effort by somebody, a perpetrator, to cause that explosion. But that's just a side issue. The more important is, as long as you feel that there's a terrorism incident or a man-made deliberate purpose, there seems to be much greater concern and draws more attention. So what is terror medicine? Well, in the course of the years, there have been many articles and even a couple of books, some of which I've been participating in, that have been published on the subject of terror medicine. It is more, the terminology has caught on more in some societies than others. Certainly in Israel, there's a full understanding of what terror medicine is. And the 4 distinctive features, or I should say the 4 pillars of terror medicine, are preparedness, incident management, nature of injuries, and psychological effects. Now, there are many overlapping aspects between terror medicine and emergency and disaster medicine, but there are also distinctive features that pertain pretty much only to a terrorism or a suspected terror attack. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about is drawing from a course that we teach with a 2-week course for senior medical students at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School. And in that course, we spend a couple of hours every morning for 2 straight weeks. And they go through exercises and videos and experiences. And there's been a really strong appreciation for this by the medical students. There are more than a dozen faculty, each representing particular specialties that apply to terrorism response, but as I said, with overlaps into emergency and disaster medicine. We have experts in infectious disease and toxicology, and surgery and psychiatry, and you'll see the relevance as I run through this. From here on, I'm going to just be showing you very brief excerpts of what we offer in class and material and curriculum. So you'll only see a spot here or there, nowhere near the completion of what we offer through the concentration of all of this day by day in the course itself. So first, preparedness. Here are some stark examples. You will recall that there was a terrorism event in 1995 in April in Oklahoma City in the United States, where a federal building was bombed and there were 168 people killed, 800 injured. That was a federal building that was about 8 blocks away from the nearest hospital. So the nearest hospital, St. Anthony's Hospital, received 153 victims, but even before all of the victims were brought to the hospital or cleared, or brought to a hospital, I should say, you see that some nurses and other personnel from the hospital had come rushing to the scene 8 blocks away. And you can also see that they got easily past the police tape, the yellow tape in the background, because they were seen as coming to an appropriate location to try to help people who were caught in the debris or otherwise not yet delivered to the hospital. It turns out that this is a perfect example of, excuse me, let me go back, of poor preparation, because not one of these three, but another nurse was killed by falling debris as she was trying to treat a patient and perhaps trying to dislodge that victim from the rubble that had fallen. So knowing what you're doing by way of preparation and understanding not only the goodwill that you want to offer, but the dangers that you might be facing if you're not prepared and properly trained in how you would respond to a terrorism or a mass casualty attack. This is an example. So here's another. In March of 2004, in Madrid, there were 4 trains that were bombed roughly at the same time in 10 different locations. 191 people were killed and 1,500 injured. Now, as you look at this picture, something stands out very clearly. Number one, you do not see any sign of fire or smoke or an immediate after effect of the explosion. And that tells you that there is a substantial amount of time that's elapsed from the time of the explosion until the time of the scene that you're looking at. Number two, what it shows you is that you do not see any identifiable medical or other kind of healthcare providers. It looks as though there are some either survivors or bystanders who were now on scene trying to help victims. But the medical response was not exactly, to say the least, quite appropriate for if there had been better preparedness and the medical community was in a better position to respond. I think you would not have seen such a long lapse between the time of the event and the arrival of appropriate medical responders. Along with that poor preparedness, this particular hospital, which was the nearest one, received over 300 victims. I don't know how many of you might be working in hospitals or closely affiliated with them, but you can imagine how beyond any hospital's capabilities an arrival in a short time of some 300 or 200 or maybe even 100 victims would just overstress and go beyond whatever capabilities the hospital ordinarily might have. Similarly, but to a lesser extent, in London, the London bus bombings and 3 underground bombings, subway bombings, occurred in 2005. And here you have, in the total of those 4 locations, 56 people killed, 700 injured. Now, focusing on a location again, the Royal London Hospital received about 200 victims, and there were other hospitals closer to suburban areas, a few miles beyond the reach of this hospital, that received 0 patients. So there was not a good pre-planning for proper distribution in this event. So here's a summary of what we've seen so far, plus an additional event in Mumbai in 2011. The receiving hospitals in each of these cases, which were the closest by and large to the events, received all of them well over 100 patients, as you can see. Now, that is beyond the capability of any hospital that I'm aware of. And the more the numbers that you get, the less competence you're able to offer to the patients or victims in need. Now, in the Boston Marathon bombings in 2013, which we referred to a little bit earlier, it's probably an inappropriate word to use, but in this case, I would say the good thing about that event, and there really is nothing good about a terrorism event or any kind of mass casualty event, but the medical response was unusually effective. There were 3 killed, there were more than 200 injured, but in part, the reason that the medical response was so effective and early is because the bombs, there were 2 bombs that were detonated. They were very close to the finish line, and at the finish line, maybe 100 yards away, there was a medical tent, and there were medical personnel right there. Plus, there were observers in the crowd who were medically trained in some fashion or another to help. So you got very quick response on behalf of the victims that might not have been the case otherwise. And when you look at the distribution of patients after the Boston Marathon bombings, you can see that the distribution is much more appropriate to treating the mass casualty events. The total of 281 patients were received in hospital. Some of them were walking wounded. They weren't seriously hurt, but the large majority needed hospital treatment and hospital care. And you can see from this distribution from Mass General, which I believe has something like 700 beds, women's and right down. And it is also the good fortune of that day that you have among these 5 level 1 trauma centers, which all of which were in a location within about a couple of miles of the actual Boston Marathon finish line. So that also made a very, very much advanced capability for treating patients. So the range of responses all the way from the appropriate times when there were shift changes, namely the morning shift was leaving and the afternoon shift was arriving. You had more than enough personnel than you ordinarily might expect at that time, or in the case of an event that would have this many casualties. So you had this combination, and while there were some very serious injuries, I believe something like 17 amputations of one limb or another, and in some cases with patients, it was one individual who would lose a couple of limbs. Still, the number of people who were survivors were quite impressive. So that, in summary, for preparedness, the range of issues that we deal with in the course that we teach has to do with having the right kind of supplies, the type and quantity and equipment, and structural enhancements. Now, we don't have much of that in the United States, but in the Israeli experience, some of their hospitals now have created walls that are 4 feet thick to prevent any possible effect, unless there's such a huge explosion that you could imagine that would blast away 4-foot thick walls, but that's unlikely the case, that they have that kind of extra precaution, and they are much better trained in Israel. The learning experience, as you'll see in a moment, is quite impressive in terms of surge capacity, but they have areas where they can shut off external ventilation as they create closed ventilation systems through various piping and protect and keep underground areas, and also the importance of plans and rehearsals and exercise cannot be emphasized enough. All right, the second area of interest is incident management. What happens on the scene of an event? And the Israeli experience here too is not adopted throughout the United States or in all other countries, but they exercise what's known as scoop and run. That means you want to keep the scene minimally occupied by victims of an attack. You want to get them out of there. And that's for a couple of reasons. And the first is that you want to beware of a second or third device, or even more, on the scene as a follow-up. Now, what happened, as a quick note, in Boston was that there were two bombers, the Tsarnaev brothers. One of them detonated his bomb more than 100 yards away from the finish line, and his brother, exactly 10 seconds later, detonated a bomb that was just about 70 or 80 yards away. By my count, had the second bombing taken place closer to the area of the first, and had it been a little longer in intervening time, instead of 10 seconds, but maybe 2 or 3 minutes, you might have had more casualties, because there would be people still trying to do recovery work in that first area. So here's an experience that the Israelis had in 2006, when the terrorist group Hezbollah was operating in Lebanon. What you're looking at is a hospital, and the side of the hospital that you're looking at is facing north. And exactly 6 miles north of this hospital was the Lebanese border, and Hezbollah controlled much of the country of Lebanon at that point, and in fact still does. And they sent numerous missiles into Israel, and one of them landed in the hospital's ophthalmology wing, which you see here on the 4th floor. And this is the damage that was caused inside. It was quite devastating. But nobody was killed and nobody was hurt, because the entire hospital at the beginning of that war was evacuated from the 4 floors above ground to a waiting area, a large open area underground, where there had been cubicles in place in case of such an event, in case of such an emergency. And each of these cubicles represented a particular specialty. Imaging could take place in one. There was some minor surgery done in the other. There was no major surgery, because all of those who were able to be evacuated, patients and personnel who were unneeded at the beginning of that war, they were sent away back home or wherever else, but not in the danger zone where they would be in the above ground normal hospital operations. So what we have here is just an example of what was going on underground during the course of that war, when a lot of normal hospital needs were being taken care of, for whether pregnancies and infections and other course of routine events were still able to be done in this underground hospital. Now, what you're looking at is a much larger hospital that's 20 miles south of the Lebanese border, and one of the missiles landed near there at Rambam Hospital in Haifa. Near meaning a block or two away. It shook the hospital, it shook the whole area, but nobody was injured in that hospital. They did not have an underground capability the way they did there was at the smaller hospital up north in the Western Galilee. So they decided, having learned the lesson of what happened up north and was quite helpful in that event, they created a 2-story underground parking lot, which you can see here, was completed in 2012. And in the event of an emergency and possible missile attacks, the cars would be evacuated within an hour and a half or so, as timed by several exercises, and be converted to a 2-floor underground, 2,000-bed hospital capability, as you see here. So the lessons within Israel were still quite clear, that while we're not going to see much of this happening in other parts of the world, it at least gives us a reference point about what is possible under the certain circumstances, and if the need is felt great enough. So the signal aspect summary of incident management. Well, there's a triage done at the scene of an incident, a very quick triage to determine how serious the injury is and send the patient off to an appropriate hospital. There's also a triage at the hospital entry, at the perimeter of a hospital, because there were some Palestinian ambulances that initially had actually brought terrorists, not just simply victims, up to the hospital entry. And as soon as that was discovered that that was a problem, there was a mandatory inspection, quick inspection of every hospital coming up toward the entryway to the emergency department. So then there were cell phone lines blocked, and that is also because of the potential for a bomb placed inside the hospital that could be detonated by a cell phone from outside. And also the clear learning, experienced learning of communications capability necessary between hospitals and with hospitals and law enforcement and other authorities, along with the need to provide communication to inquiring families and friends. The third area of distinctiveness about terrorism and the possible overlap that you might expect, perhaps more on a military field than you ever would in normal civilian life. Penetrations from nails and screws or shrapnel. Here you see a picture of a 14-year-old girl who was a victim during a terrorism attack at a pizza place, Sbarro's Pizza, in 2001. There were more than 50 penetration wounds. And as you look at this, these are probably, the ones that you see here in the leg are not apparently life-threatening. On the other hand, when they penetrate other areas of the body, as in this case with nails that were released during an explosion, a close quarter explosion by a suicide bomber, they can penetrate vital organs. If they hit the spleen, they will cause huge bleeding, and a person can bleed out internally and not survive much longer. And so what happens with the nature of the injuries and their response is the capability of doing a triage as the surgeon looks to see his victim or patient in front of him, what to do and where to go first. This is also not to be forgotten. Definitely chemical, biological, or other kinds of exposures that might manifest that may have nothing to do with a sudden bombing or a kinetic effect. Here you see the potential for cutaneous anthrax. This became a particular issue in the United States when letters containing dried anthrax spores were sent out, about a half dozen letters, that created not only victims. There were 22 people who became infected, half of them cutaneous skin lesions, and the other half respiratory. They had breathed in the spores. 5 of those people who had inhalation anthrax died as a result of their exposures. While these definitely differ in terms of appearance and in terms of effect, it's up to the medical community, particularly in biological attacks, to be aware, because the most likely person to detect a possible biological attack will not be the police, and not be the fire department, or not be the general surgeon, but rather a physician who is either in the emergency medicine field or a dermatologist who might be able to be the first identified person to identify the possible attack. Similarly, radiation poisoning. This is much in the news now. This particular case, Alexander Litvinenko, who died in 2006, just a few weeks after he looked, as you see to your left, the picture of a pretty young-looking, healthy guy, died about 3 to 4 weeks after as a result of polonium radiation exposure. The reason that it's in the news now is because that this happened in London, and he was a former government official in the former Soviet Union and in Russia. Now, the same kind of thing just happened whereby a person was poisoned and his daughter were poisoned. We're not exactly sure if it was a nerve agent, and if it was it VX, was it sarin? The point being that That is an ongoing case, and it brings up memories again of what happened here. We do not know the perpetrator for sure in the London situation, but we are aware, I believe the Prime Minister Theresa May, has pointed to the Russians again as possible or probable perpetrators. So the signal aspects of injuries, well, as you can see, the whole list of possibilities for close quarter suicide attacks especially. Numerous penetration wounds if there are nails or nuts or bolts in the explosive mix. Blast injury, blunt inhalation injuries from the debris that's flying around, crush and burns. And apart from the last where we list their biological, chemical, or radiological, I've asked several surgeons, trauma surgeons who are experienced. I said, how many times have you seen a single patient that has virtually all of these or most of these injuries? And they say, well, that's very unusual, if ever. Except if you're on a military field, then you might possibly see the combinations. But the point being that after a suicide bombing attack, the Israelis especially would find that many individual patients would have most or all of these kinds of injuries, which creates a larger challenge for triaging about, well, what do I deal with first? And do I get to the respiratory tract, or do I get to bleed? What is it first? But you obviously want to save lives as quickly as possible. As a quick parenthesis, when I showed you scoop and run, if a person absolutely needed life-saving care, if they're bleeding out, or if there's a blockage to the respiratory system, they would get some effective help on the ground immediately, but very quickly, because scoop and run means get the victims out of that scenario as quickly as you can. All right. Third area, injuries response, and now fourth area, psychological effects. Again, through the Israeli experience, but we don't only need the Israeli experience. Certainly in the United States, we were aware after 9/11 of the huge emotional and psychological effects that had on not only victims directly affected by the bombings of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, but the people who survived, and also some others who were hearing about it from the news, which also raises the level of anxiety. And it was the findings through studies that have been published by this Dr. Shalev, who was a director of psychiatry at Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, that the intensity of the initial psychological reaction from a terror attack is much higher than from other traumatic events like a fire or road accident. And the importance as well now of long-term psychophysical care. You cannot just dismiss the notion that if a person undergoes an early psychotherapy or some kind of assistance with a counselor, that will automatically assist them in avoiding long-term needs. And there must be consideration for that in any of our societies. Another aspect of psychological effects is the ability to be resilient. And it's not just the character of an individual that is involved here, but a sense of community and social integration and a sense of social commonality. So here you have a fairly typical example. After, for example, during the Intifada in those 2000 to 2005 years, there were explosions in here at this Cafe Hillel, as there were explosions in shopping malls or on buses, and there were numerous victims and considerable damage. But here's what happened. Within days, and in some cases a couple of weeks, these facilities will be completely restored, back in business. Not only do they look as though they are pristine and never have been the victim areas, locations of bombings, but people come in and they frequent them. They go for lunch and they still continue to have meals. People continue to ride buses. They continue to go to shopping malls, even in the short period after an attack, as soon as the location is brought back to a pretty much normal situation. This is societal resilience, and it gives a sense of strength that you will not let the terrorists win. We had a fair amount of that. I saw an image, which I don't believe I have up here, about the resilience in the United States. Soon after the Boston Marathon bombing, when the Boston baseball team, the Red Sox, played in Los Angeles on the other coast, there were huge signs in Los Angeles put up saying that we are with you in Boston. And they showed a great deal of empathy and a feeling of commonality about this country, and the United States in this case, not being cowed or put into an intimidating position by way of terrorism. So the signal psychological issues, there's an unusually intense early reaction by people who experience a terror event, but it's important to have early and quick psychological intervention. And don't forget the importance of availability of long-term care and then societal resistance. So what I've done is I've listed 10, this slide and the next will show my near concluding slides of what I consider to be summary key aspects. There are many other aspects of terror medicine, but these are some of the most important as I see them. And some of it I've mentioned in the discussion up until now, and some of it is new, but just keep them in mind. Number one, after an initial attack, you must be aware of the possibility of a second or third follow-up attack, and you must act accordingly. Number two, if there are many casualties, try not just try, but do not send overwhelming numbers of patients to one, usually near the nearest hospital. You must have a plan that would allow for rehearsal and plan for distribution to accommodate the surge of patients in several hospitals to be most effective. Number three, if an event is thought to be deliberate, it's best to evacuate the patients from the area, not to treat them on site. And as I mentioned before, with the exception of an immediate life-threatening need. The quick evacuation, scoop and run, means there's less chance of exposure to follow-up terror attacks. And also more treatment capabilities are available in a hospital. So you have that double reason. Number four, under some circumstances, you want to consider inspecting all arriving ambulances at the perimeter of a hospital before it gets too close to the actual entryway. Number five, if more than one person collapses, convulsing and foaming at the mouth, you must consider the likelihood of an organophosphate exposure. And sarin is an example, VX, another, Soman. They all are organophosphates. In fact, these organophosphates were first developed in Germany in the late 1930s, though they were never used on a battlefield. We see more of that being used now in Syria. And it's very unfortunate, especially since among the other horrors that the civilian population have been facing in Syria have been attacks with organophosphates, but I'll get to show you more about that in our last slide. Now, the responders, as those of you who read carefully about the Litvinenko attack, I shouldn't say the Litvinenko attack, but the current attack with an organophosphate in London, where the father, who was the target, and his daughter, who was with him, were exposed and are in serious critical condition. But also, one of the responders was a policeman who got close to them and also became ill from the exposure to apparently either sarin or VX. This is definitely a problem when there are large numbers of casualties from an organophosphate, that rushing to the medical, to be of medical assistance may not be a very good idea unless you're wearing protective personal equipment, and your own safety would be risked in that case. A continuation, number 6, close quarter suicide bombing may cause combinations of injuries like, which I mentioned before, penetration, blast, blunt, inhalation, crush and burn. that are rarely or even never seen in a single patient otherwise. If a hospital receives an imminent bomb threat, consider shutting electronic communication, since cell phones may be used to detonate a bomb. I mentioned that before. Number 8, this is you may initially say, well, so what's the big deal about this one? Commonly experienced symptoms like fatigue, fever, certain cutaneous lesions, or chest pain may also be signs of a biological or chemical attack. Now that seems like almost a throwaway line. Okay, sure, so that's possible. What am I supposed to do? Every time if I see a patient who complains of some of these issues, should I be suspecting a terrorist attack? The answer to that is it should not be the #1 concern that you would have, but don't drop it as a possibility. I can tell you this from my own experience in writing about the anthrax letters and interviewing patients and victims, as well as medical personnel, that had it not been for a particularly aware man involved with internal medicine who had a microbiology training, who happened to see the spinal fluid from an ostensible victim that was on October 5th that victim died. That was a couple of weeks after anthrax had been sent out by mail. And this particular doctor, against the current of thinking in his hospital, said we've really got to check to see whether this might have been anthrax. And it turned out that that was correct. And one of the great warning consequences of that incident in the September and October period, when anthrax letters were sent out in 2001, one of the great learning experiences was that 9 people had contracted anthrax without knowing it, and the physicians either guessed wrong, misdiagnosed, or a laboratory test that they sent out if they were looking for possible anthrax. Laboratory tests mistakenly came back negative. So 9 people had already been walking around as anthrax victims, most of them cutaneous skin anthrax, a couple inhalation, before it was understood that anthrax had been a disease that had invaded the civilian population in areas of the country where it never should have. So that's what brought our attention to the fact that there was anthrax at that point. Okay, so number 9, we get to the psychological effects, that terror attacks generate more intense fear and anxiety than natural or accidental events. And that was certainly highlighted with the difference between the Boston Marathon concerns long after the event with those of a couple of days later, the event that happened in Southwest Texas with the fertilizer explosion. 10th and finally on this list is psychologically traumatized victims of terror require immediate treatment to minimize long-term effects. Now, this is the last slide that I'm showing you, and it's actually a video. You can see by the heading up on top that this is a video of a couple of years ago in Syria when there was a nerve gas attack. It was suspected originally that it was a nerve gas sarin, but it was confirmed after some laboratory testing afterwards. And I'll let the video explain itself.
The U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee released videos on Saturday showing victims of an alleged Syrian chemical weapons attack. The horrifying footage shows Syrian men, women, and children struggling to breathe and convulsing. They are the apparent victims of a nerve gas poisoning. The graphic images have been held up by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry as proof positive the Assad regime used the chemical agent sarin in the early morning attack in the rebel-held Damascus suburb on August 21st. Nerve agents such as sarin are typically delivered via a binary shell containing 2 component chemicals. Upon firing, the rupture disc separating the chemicals breaks. The spinning of the shell mixes the chemicals together to form the toxic agent, which is released upon impact. Sarin can be inhaled, ingested, or absorbed through the skin. Once inside, the body attacks the central nervous system, bringing an agonizing death to those exposed to large doses. UN investigators were dispatched to the suburbs of Damascus to meet and take samples from victims of the attack. The European Union on Saturday urged the US to hold off on military action until the preliminary report was submitted. US intelligence reports have estimated casualties of the attack numbering 1,429 people, over 400 of whom are believed to have been children.
Well, I am sure that you are as horrified by that as I am. And this continues to go on in Syria. There are mass casualties almost on a daily basis, either by way of bombings and kinetic forms of terror to the civilian population, or periodically releases of chemical agents, and particularly these nerve agents. What do we do about it? Well, thus far, we haven't seen very much to have caused that kind of behavior to stop. We are quite sure, we meaning the United Nations and certainly the United States and others who have examined the issue, we're quite certain that these are all being perpetrated by the Syrian government, the Bashar Assad regime, against his own people. And there is absolutely no other conceivable notion about why this would be done except to terrorize the population into submission. So it is a large-scale form of terrorism. We're less likely to see that large scale in several countries, some of the Western countries for sure that are developed, but we do continue to see terrorism as its own form of plague on our populations, and it is something that, by way of responsibility of the medical community and the healthcare community in general, we have a responsibility. And not only that, but governments all over the world have an absolute responsibility to try to prevent terrorism, and at the same time, an equal responsibility to be prepared to respond to them. And with response comes a proper response, comes a basis of knowledge, experience, training, exercise, education. And with that, I am finished with the presentation, and I appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Professor Cole. Now we're at the part of the webinar where we can take questions from the remote audience. You can click on the raise hand icon, and I can unmute your microphone and you can ask Professor Cole any questions. All right, I have one here from, looks like Patrick Lynch. Patrick, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone. Patrick's on telephone, so I had to send you just a pin request that should allow me to unmute your microphone. But he did send his question in. So let me see if we have any other participants with their hands raised. While I pull up that question, I do have one question. Maybe I can break the ice here for you, Professor Cole. With respect to the Boston Marathon bombing, you had mentioned the distribution of patients throughout the Boston metropolitan area. That was a very good distribution of patients, and coupled with the fact that you had several trauma centers in the immediate area really enhanced the response to that event. How much of that was intentionally planned out in terms of distributing patients to so many different hospitals? Do you have a sense of that?
Yes. In fact, we've written a couple of papers about that. It was a marvelous coincidence that there had been a citywide exercise only a few weeks before the Boston Marathon. Or maybe it wasn't such a coincidence. Maybe there was an anticipation that this would be good timing in advance of an event like the marathon. But there was definitely good planning, good behavioral capabilities, aside from the fact that, as you mentioned, and as I had said earlier, that there were terrific hospitals in the immediate area. But there were individuals, physicians, who were part of those hospitals. I'm not sure which one. I think it might have even been Mass General, the largest of the hospitals, where the emergency department was headed by an Israeli physician, a guy who was from Israel, serving in the American hospital at that time, who, well in advance of that particular event, had created information and helped to formulate exercises where there was cooperation that turned out quite well.
Okay, thank you for that response. I do have Patrick Lynch's question here. Unfortunately, because he's participating by phone, I apparently can't unmute his microphone. So I'm just going to go ahead and read it for him. And Patrick says, would Dr. Cole be able to address U.S. hospitals and the use of hospital incident command system in their response to the described terror attacks?
That's a great question. And I'll answer it by giving you a kind of a broader answer that most, never mind only hospitals, but teaching institutions, medical schools, barely mention anything about terrorism per se. And there are some indications of attacks that we've experienced, or at least are familiar with in the United States, whereby it's in my opinion, a dereliction of duty not to spend time. For example, sarin and VX have absolutely no other uses except for deliberate killing or deliberate infliction of injury or terror. There's no beneficial use in any form from the actual nerve agents. And I think that ought to be very clearly stressed in the form of education in the regular medical school curriculum and by way of hospital discussion. We wrote a paper. So, by the way, you can see a lot more about terror medicine if you just Google the term terror medicine. I think you'll see a fair amount of literature that will help answer some of these questions, because there have been articles about the need for hospital preparedness and exercises. So some hospitals do a better job than others, but I think it ought to become standard. In the same way that we have fire preparations and fire drills, even though very, very few hospitals ever experience a major fire, that you have routines for those. And I think you should have routines for whether you call them active shooting incidents or terrorism incidents, that ought to be part of the standard procedures.
Okay, we have another question here. Everyone seems to be a little shy today, so they're sending the questions to me. So I'll just go ahead and read them. So here's a question from Paul Riga, and Paul asked or says, shouldn't the lay public be exposed to terror medical education, such as how to utilize tourniquets to prevent bleeding out?
Oh, well, that's a very interesting question. When you say the broad public, sure, but I don't think you're ever going to see enough of an impetus, even though I think it would be a wise suggestion, especially if it's implemented beyond just being a suggestion. There ought to be a clear understanding of how tourniquets should be used within a hospital as well. Earlier on, we used to think that just tying a limb or creating area of a tourniquet need would be beneficial, just by way of, say, tying almost a thin rope around somebody's arm. But that would not be a wise idea. You've got to have a flat surface of whatever the implement is, not just a rope, but a flatter, broader material. And you have to create a certain amount of pressure. And that really is something that ought to be taught not only to the general public, probably not much success there, but to the medical personnel who must be trained properly, and those who would show any kind of interest. So can you make it mandatory? Well, at some level you can say, yes, mandatory training and exercises like fire drills and what you do in case of a potential event would be, I think, a plus. But as I am fully aware, there are costs and expenses to all of this, whether it's time and man or woman power that's being diverted, or if you're going to spend $50,000 a year for exercises to be prepared in case of a terror event or an active shooter event, the hospital president and budget people will say, well, 50,000, that may be cutting into the need that we have for a dietitian or some other aspect of a hospital need. So I understand the potential pressures, the cross pressures, but you will always be happier if there is an event. You'll always be happier that you had prepared properly than if you catch yourself flat-footed and there are more casualties than there need to be.
All right, I'm going to jump to a brave participant in the remote audience who has her hand raised. Hannah, and I apologize if I mispronounce your last name, Kate or Katie. Hannah, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone and you can ask a question to Professor Cole. Are you there, Hannah?
Yes, I'm
Hello?
here. Actually, Hannah, yeah, do you hear me?
Yep, we hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, so actually, I'm a general surgery resident. I'm from Syria, from Aleppo. And actually, I'm connecting now from Berlin, Germany. I recently moved to Berlin to continue my surgery studies. I just want to share a comment. In addition to what the professor shared, it's really hard to work in a situation like terror medicine situation when you live or you work in the same place or the same area where your community, your family lived. I want to add that in addition to the all stress and pressure that you will have during your work or during receiving the patients and the injuries, I'm telling you from my personal experience, looking at the eyes or the faces of the patients that they are coming into the emergency department, I was always looking in the faces, wishing or hoping not to see a familiar face. That's really a lot more pressure than working in a place that it's a little bit far from where you live or far from your area, like seeing a brother's face or a friend's face between the injuries. It makes it really hard. I just want to add one more thing, not to forget that during the work too, it's very possible that you want to take the patient to the operation room, but there is no electricity, for example, or there is no water to provide a safe and right like operation or help for the patient. Just wanted to share this from my experience, and of course I can share more of my personal experience later with the professor. Thank you.
Yes, well, I want to thank you so much for your response. It is heartrending, and it's hard to imagine what it would be like in a situation that you describe when you are a medical responder and you're in the midst of the area that is being attacked. You spoke beautifully and eloquently about that kind of dilemma. I should say that in most cases that we in the West have experienced terrorism, or even elsewhere in the world, there are discrete events, and there is not a continuation, as there is in Syria, of ongoing threats and more attacks that would just make it virtually impossible to offer the kind of care that you need. And the emotional effect of what you said in particular, that as you're looking at the faces of the people, you're hoping that it is not somebody you know or somebody in your own family. That's a dimension of horror and terror that is just even so much more deplorable. And I just want to thank you personally for bringing that to our attention.
Okay, we have another participant in the remote audience who'd like to ask a question directly. Barry Burton, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone and you can ask your question. Okay, are you there, Barry?
Do you have me now?
Yep, loud and clear. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cole, for your presentation. I also teach, although retired from clinical practice, disaster medicine and management, and have had the opportunity to listen to Isaac Ashkenazi and talk with individuals that were on World Trade Center Ground Zero, as well as the Boston bombing. In your opinion and your experience, much more studied than I am, do you believe, following the Hartford Consensus guidelines, that the first care providers, being the citizens and bystanders, benefit from the permissiveness to allow them to continue to support the people around them even after the uniformed resources arrive at the scene? And I'm talking specifically about the mass triage method, where uniforms tend to want to sort those folks and remove them from the environment. I believe that that's a mental health insult in the pathway of their recovery. I'd like to hear your opinion.
Well, actually, I was editor of one of the books that we wrote about terror medicine, and we got we have an article in there by Dr. Buria Adini about the role of bystanders or survivors of an attack. And I think she eloquently lays out the case of the value of bystanders who, under proper management by an incident commander, can be very useful. The uses can range from a couple of blocks, posting some of these people a couple of blocks away to redirect traffic or redirect the people away from the area of concern, right through being carriers, if necessary, of patients who have to be brought away from the scene. So I see a great potential for the proper use and participation of willing bystanders. You don't want too many of them running around just sort of haphazardly trying to control a situation. But I agree with you that there is a use for them in a constructive way, but that requires a little more community education in the United States than we've had until now. What should the proper role be, and how do you identify the incident commander? I know that in some locations, Israel, for example, it's quite clear who the commander is. They will tend to wear a hat that identifies them as in that capacity. And you must have appropriate coordination through a hierarchy of understanding of who's going to be the director or the commander in a situation to have the most efficient way of responding that you possibly can.
All right, so do you have a few more minutes, Professor Cole? Looks like we have 2 questions left.
Yes, sure.
Okay, so these were just sent over the question feature. And so the first one is from Tim Kirkpatrick, and Tim asks, can you distinguish a sarin or VX exposure from an industrial, an agriculture industrial exposure to pesticide?
That's a great question. And here again, I can point out to you the experience of the Israelis in one case. Back in the first Gulf War, when Israel was on the receiving end of missiles from Iraq, that's when Saddam Hussein was still the president of Iraq. During that war, there was a concern in that country that chemicals would be introduced by these missiles, and that could be sarin or VX. And they were quite worried. There were air raids. Every citizen of Israel then, every resident of Israel had gas masks at the ready. And in one case, because of the immediate short-term chemical reading that they got, they believed that there was actually sarin in the explosive material that would have meant a spread of sarin through a certain area community. And they were alarmed, quite seriously so. And about 3 or 4 hours following the event, with more careful analysis, laboratory analysis, it was very clear that the chemical indications were from some kind of produce by an industrial plant or location that had been hit. And there was a release of some chemical materials that mimicked what you might expect from an actual poison chemical attack. So this was of great concern, and it is a continuing concern that you must be able to differentiate quickly between standard industrial, whether insecticides or other kind of organophosphate materials, from an actual use of the nerve agent. I believe it is a continuing problem. It's not that we're not capable in immediate short-term laboratory techniques to make a clear differentiation. But having said that, my own supposition is that it's better to make errors on the side of safety and assume the worst. And if there's the sarin has not already killed people, that even if there were a weaker composition of the sarin than would be immediately lethal, that you still should take appropriate precautions with medical countermeasures. But thanks for that question.
Okay, we have just a few more here. We have a question from Eric Palmer, and Eric asks, have you had any experience with crisis standards of care?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by crisis standards of care. There are standard protocols that are issued in the case of infectious disease or chemical exposures or radiological by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which you can get from their website. Then there are standard protocols for a surgeon who is now faced with the dilemma, the short-term dilemma, we hope, of triaging and going for what would be the most appropriate, or I should say the most acute needs of a person in distress as a result of an attack. So there are protocols out there for virtually any sort of exposure or attack. Not all of the protocols will ensure that you get great care, but again, they're available for people to learn from and use.
All right, and this looks like it's our last question from Daniel Kolek. It's a two-part question, and Daniel says, can you comment on the concept of a forward body line, referring to an area where suddenly there are a number of dead or down non-trauma patients who may not yet be foaming or seizing? Is this a risk factor for contaminated events we should consider?
Absolutely. If you just say that they're down and they're not foaming and they're not convulsing or twitching in some fashion, that should not disqualify your concerns if you see multiple numbers of people collapsing roughly at the same time. If you see one person down, I think it's probably built into human nature at its best, or even what your standard response would be if you're an emergency responder. You want to get over to that person and help them. That's your initial inclination, and it's an appropriate and a very generous and appropriate inclination. But if you see one person down, I suppose it would be acceptable, in fact, highly desirable that you want to get over and help that person. If you see two or three go down roughly at the same time, I think that your suspicion antennae ought to be raised. And it would be at that point that I would say, you've got to concern yourself about protection. Now, sarin does penetrate cloth and gets down into your skin. But if there is any manner of protection available to you by way of less permeable material than ordinary cloth, even a Tyvek suit, which is not entirely protective against the penetration of certain nerve agents, but would give you a better capability for protection than if you had, just say, a sweater between you and your skin and the nerve agent. Then you must see that. And even if it sounds heartless, if you are quite sure that you're seeing a nerve agent, if you're seeing people showing symptoms of nerve agent exposure, in my opinion, it would be a mistake to go rushing in and be close to them. You very well might become the next victim if that's the case.